We would like to thank the Aronson family for their generous endowment for lectures in science and society, which enabled this event to happen. And we'd like to thank Institute for Sustainable Future for their role in coordinating this panel and the entire visit. I'd also like to thank Andrew Flax and Steve Hallett, who had the idea to invite our guest speaker, Seth Holmes, to campus for many events. So thank you to them. Before I introduce Dr. Holmes, I would like to turn the microphone over to Kimber Nicoletti to talk about her programs.
Buenas tardes. Okay, I wanted to see if anybody knows basic Spanish at least, right? My name is Kimber Nicoletti Martinez, and I am the director and founder of MESA Community Empowerment and Violence Prevention Program. And we work across really the state of Indiana and all around the United States doing violence prevention work, sexual violence. We also recently added a bullying prevention project. But we've had a specific focus for many years on working in farm worker communities. I come from a farm worker background myself, and we work on all sorts of levels through education, empowerment, economic opportunity, food distribution. I'm sure a lot of you have received emails from me begging for stuff because I'm really good at that. And then I also took on a role with the Agribility Project, Indiana Agribility, and the National Agribility Project because it married up with the work with farm workers. This is specifically around doing advocacy with farm workers with disabilities. And by disabilities, that could be physical disabilities, visible or invisible disabilities, mental health disabilities, and really educating and empowering and advocating for farm workers and the chronic stress and health issues that they face. So thanks for being here, and I'll pass the mic back.
Thanks, Kimber. There's a few spots up here and in here for people who are looking for seats. Yep, yeah, there's a couple in the second row, and there's really almost one seat, I think, in every row, at least one seat. So it's my pleasure today to introduce Dr. Seth Holmes. You're sitting in the middle of the panel, so you want to wave so people know who you are. There you go. Thank you. The rest of you, terribly important. But I'm not introducing you, so sorry. That's Andrew's job. So Seth Holmes is a professor in the Division of Society and Environment in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley, and he's also the co-chair of the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. He is a medical anthropologist and a physician, which I think is probably a rare combination, I imagine. Works on social hierarchies, health inequities, and the ways in which such asymmetries are naturalized, normalized, and resisted. He investigated these issues in the context of US-Mexico immigration and migration, transnational agro-food systems, and public health in a project that led to the production of this book called Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies. If you haven't read this book, I highly, highly recommend it. We were using it in a series of classes that we're teaching in horticulture and landscape architecture, and it's really phenomenal. Well, I've got some students sitting here, so they can, nod or shake their heads or something. At really helping students and helping us empathize with people, with a variety of different people from similar and very different perspectives than our own and very different life experiences than our own. And I think that's a really valuable thing for students to learn how to do. This research for this book was conducted in collaboration with indigenous Mexican immigrant communities and families and was recently published in Spanish, Portuguese, and German, and will come out in French and Italian in the next year. And it has won national awards in anthropology, sociology, geography, and Latin American studies, all very, very well deserved, as was the film that we saw last night. So if you didn't get a chance to see that, I also highly recommend that. So to start us off on the panel, our moderator, who I'm going to introduce, is Dr. Andrew Flax. Wave so they know who you are. There you go. This panel last year, I was sitting on the panel and Andrew's in the audience and he asked me a really hard question. So, you're moderating. I guess I can't ask you a hard question. Andrew Flax is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology, specializing in environmental anthropology. His research areas include sustainable agriculture in the environmental relationships in the context of markets, ecology, state interventions, and social networks. And he has published widely on this topic, in particular working among farmers in North America, the Balkans, and South India. And it's over to you.
Hi. I'm very glad to be here on the other side of the audience this time around, and luckily, even better, not having to answer any questions from any of you folks, because I'm here to introduce far more qualified people. We've convened this panel here today to discuss a larger idea in and around sustainable relationships between all forms of life in agricultural spaces. Indiana grown. A bit of branding, a bit of marketing, a approach to thinking about agriculture here in the state. In this panel, the panelists are going to locate their own work on these topics of being on Earth, race, place, and economics in the issues of work, migration, environmental, and public health, using these ideas around location and production and farm products seen in marketing campaigns like this one, Indiana Grown, which is an Indiana State Department of Agriculture initiative created to promote products that are grown or made by Hoosiers for Hoosiers. Many such narratives do a lot of different kinds of social work. Feeding the world, feeding a growing population, if we want to give that a slightly more Malthusian fascist edge. These are important things to think about and think with and think through when we consider some of the unasked questions of how we grow food, who it's for, how we nourish life on Earth, who are our imagined partners and stakeholders, who's left out of these kinds of stories we tell about nourishing life on Earth. As always, who benefits? In each of these narratives, there are larger stories and larger patterns of social and other kinds of inequality. Things around work, around access, around opportunity. And through some of our narratives, these inequalities that are of a social and political nature come to be seen as natural, as a priori, as existing without a historical context. I can't think of four better panelists to disabuse us of those false notions and lift these veils from our eyes and allow us to have a great conversation about nourishing life on Earth here in Indiana Grown. I'd like to introduce everybody at the beginning, and then folks, I'm going to point to you when it's your turn to come up and have your 10 minutes. So Nathan Swanson, please wave your hand. Wonderful. Clinical assistant professor in the John Martinson Honors College. He's a political and cultural geographer whose research areas include the study of public space and power, as well as the geopolitics of everyday life. Power, a word I'm sure we're going to hear a lot from everybody today. Dr. Yuki Reese is associate professor in the Department of Public Health and director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Health and Human Sciences. Her research areas include reducing health disparities and identifying protective factors that enable vulnerable populations to overcome adversity, with an emphasis on positive youth outcomes. Next up, Dr. Seth Holmes, who we'll hear more about you later, I guess. And last on the edge there, but not least, Dr. Ariana Torres, associate professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, as well as horticulture and landscape architecture. Her research areas include the decision-making processes of specialty crop farmers, along with customers' perceptions and preferences, as well as the economic impacts of grower decision-making processes. Nowhere is power absent here, so let's hear more about it. Dr. Holmes.
All right. It's great to be here at Purdue. Thank you for inviting me. John Martinson Honors College. Did I add any syllables? Nope. And the Institute for Sustainable Futures and all the other groups that are here. It's great to get to know you. I got to meet with graduate students and postdocs today who are doing important work on issues, many of which are related to the Midwest and agriculture and diversity within agriculture of many different levels and many different kinds, and are asking great questions. I flew in from Barcelona, so I'm a little jet lagged, and I'll talk a little bit about a project that I'm working on that has me there. In the John F. Kennedy Airport last night in New York City, where I had my layover, I was sitting next to an empty bag of Indiana popcorn that on the back, I took a picture of it, and on the back it talked all about how it was grown in Indiana and why that's important. And then, of course, in the Indianapolis airport, there's the Indiana Grown Farmers Market restaurant, which I also took a picture of. So the topic's super interesting to me. I don't do work in Indiana, so I'll share some of the work that I've done, some of the things I've learned from people who I collaborate with in research, and then kind of hope that that's a provocation to how it relates to here. There are more seats if you want a seat, because you have a Purdue sweatshirt. But there's some like over there. Maybe you could raise your hand if there's a seat next to you. All right. So the font size is changed in the emailing of the slides, but you can pretend that everything fits in boxes. And so I'm currently really interested in how food and the growing of food connects people, different kinds of people, and how those connections become invisibilized or hidden. And I'm interested in the ways in which certain kinds of identities get put onto food, like Indiana grown, for example, or the Indiana popcorn. And maybe even what does it mean, like if someone says Hoosier, what kind of people do people imagine? And what kind of other Hoosiers might not be imagined? Like what color of skin, what kind of jobs, what kind of social class, etc. Similarly, when I'm coming from Barcelona, I will be called, or in many parts of the world, even in the US, I will be called an American, and that word will carry certain kinds of racialized, classed assumptions that don't fit the experience of lots of people in this country and in lots of other countries that are part of America or the Americas. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about my work and how it makes me think about this. So for the book Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, I lived with and worked with indigenous Mexican migrant farm workers whose native language is Triqui, and then most of them learned Spanish either when they were kids in school or when they arrived in the US in order to work with other Latin American migrant farm workers, because the language that they spoke within the borders of currently Mexico was not Spanish. And together we looked at social inequalities, the ways in which those social inequalities come to be understood as normal or natural, both in society at large and on the farm and in healthcare, how doctors and nurses came to understand those social inequalities as part of nature or part of DNA. We thought a lot about how different bodies were perceived and treated, what kinds of jobs different people have in agriculture, and how that often relates very much to racialization, to class, and to citizenship. We thought about mobility, and both Doris Schlesinger is a geographer who maybe you know her work better than I do, who wrote about power geometry and the ways in which certain people have the power to leave a certain space. Other people are forced to stay in that space. Certain people have the power to stay and other people are forced to leave. And we thought a lot about the North American Free Trade Agreement and how that affected specifically indigenous people in southern Mexico, displacing them from their land such that they needed actually to migrate rather far to work in the US in order for their families overall to be able to stay. So those are some of the things we worked on. The research took place in Oaxaca and the borderlands with the US and the Central California and Washington state. And then most recently, the second generation of Triqui people directed a film that I was honored to produce and write grants to help fund, thinking about their experience as indigenous immigrants in the US in farm worker communities. And a lot of what we saw was that the labor that these racialized, classed, and illegalized people in terms of citizenship did harmed their bodies at the same time that they engaged in lots of practices to take care of themselves and their families and their neighbors. And their labor provided food for society that allowed society, the rest of society, to be very healthy. So there was this sort of exchange of health, harm for some people and health for other people in the exact same kind of interaction or relationship, that then you can think through the way that immigrants are often talked about politically that erases that exchange, that relationship. During COVID, of course, in the US and the UK and Europe and many places, awareness grew about migrant farm workers and the importance of farm workers from different places and their living conditions. And part of what I'm working on now is thinking through all the different ways that immigrants, both as laborers on farms and agriculture, but also laboring bodies within supply chains, truck drivers, people who move food after it was picked, and consumers who eat that food, how we're all very much related. We're like intimately related. The cells in my body would not have the carbons and hydrogens that they have if it weren't for the people who drove the trucks, the people who picked the food, the people who dealt with the pesticides, et cetera. And that all relates to all of our health, all the people in the food system. And yet, sometimes certain foods have ethno-national or regional understanding and identity that's put onto them that erases those relationships. So I've been in Barcelona because we're starting a project where we're following 3 different foods and the people and their bodies and their bodily experiences that relate to those foods. So we're following the California strawberry and specifically people from southern Mexico who are working in strawberry fields, the Valencia orange in Spain, and specifically both Ecuadorian and indigenous people, many of whom work in agriculture in Spain, and North African workers. And then the German asparagus, primarily with Romanian workers, both white Romanian and Roma people, and also with some Syrian refugees. And then after that, we're working with all the supply chain workers. So the first part, we're thinking through how production works, how it affects people's bodies. The second part, we're thinking about transportation, supply chains, how it affects people's bodies. And many of the people who work in these supply chain systems are immigrants or from immigrant backgrounds or racialized in a way that relates to immigration. And we're especially working with truck drivers, but all the people within the supply chain. And then we're working with the people who eat these items. So in California, for many good reasons, many of us who are progressive eaters want to eat California strawberries. And we don't eat strawberries from Mexico. We're trying to eat local. We don't want the climate change to happen as much. At the same time, that understanding of the California strawberry can bring this racialized and kind of citizenship understanding of what who's involved and who grew it and who didn't. And at the same time that maybe the people who are picking the strawberries in California actually were also picking the strawberries in Mexico, or maybe they're brothers or cousins. And maybe actually in California, the strawberries that are coming from California are coming from further away than the ones from Mexico. And in the cases on the farms where I worked in Oregon and California, many of those berries were packaged in the plastic clamshells that said California because the company's headquarters was in California. So if you're in Santa Cruz, studying at UC Santa Cruz, you might buy something from Driscoll because it's in Watsonville, it's right next door. But actually, those strawberries or blueberries might have been picked by the people who were in the film up in Washington State. And then in the German, so there's this interesting California US berries are better than Mexican berries for lots of different reasons, but all kinds of relationships then get forgotten. With the German asparagus, in my experience, having lived some in Germany, there's all kinds of excitement about it's asparagus time. There are these crazy huge asparagus, I don't know. And they're these white asparagus that have no green in them. People are really excited. We really want German asparagus. And there are festivals, and there are asparagus queens, and there are asparagus princesses, and there's photo shoots with young women holding asparagus in all kinds of little German towns. And there are festivals, and there's asparagus ice cream. But no one's excited about Polish asparagus that might be from closer by and might be exactly the same. And the idea of this German asparagus brings with it understandings of Germanness and ethnic Germanness. In Germany, if your family has lived in Germany for 5 generations, but you're not white, you are said to have an immigration background, or even sometimes legally you're called a outlander, like you're from a different land, even if your family's been there for a long time. So the workers from Romania, from Poland, et cetera, aren't being remembered as part of this experience, and that's part of what I'm interested in and troubled by, and some of the people I work with are interested in and troubled by. And then a similar thing in Spain. When it's Valencia Orange time, there are dances and big dresses and music festivals and photo shoots. And just last week, there's this huge fight between, some like ritualized fight between people standing on a truck wearing certain kinds of outfits that I don't understand, throwing oranges at all the crowd, and the crowd throws oranges at them, and everyone thinks it's fun, and I don't. Then some people are bloody on TV. But the relationship with Morocco and Ecuador and post-coloniality isn't experienced in the experience of eating that orange. Like, this is a Valencia orange, this is Spanish, I am in Spain. But what about all the connections? So that's part of what I'm thinking through when I hear Indiana grown, or any kind of identity within a food. So I went back and forth between having this first slide called Gastro Identity and Gastro Invisibilize, partially because the farm worker on the first slide, you might remember, is sort of, it's his silhouette, and part of what the farm workers I work with and I are interested in is how their really important presence gets silhouetted or invisibilized. Some of the people I worked with pointed out every time former President Trump did an executive order against Mexican people or against immigrants, they would point out he wouldn't have the energy to sign that bill or say that statement without the food that he ate that we provided. So like his racist actions rely on the energy that we and people like us provide through the grocery stores and restaurants, et cetera. So both in the US and in these other places, we're looking at the invisibilization of embodied connections in food circuits that are very intimate in many ways, both through infrastructure. There's been in anthropology and geography and some other humanities and social sciences a sort of infrastructural turn, becoming more aware that we don't usually think about any infrastructure until it breaks. There aren't roads, there isn't a heating system, there's no lights. We never think about those things until the road breaks, or the train stops working, or the supply chain stops working. All of a sudden we have people doing supply chain studies because COVID messed everything up. So how does infrastructure affect the bodies of the people whose labor and their bodies in some ways are treated as part of infrastructure, and they're only noticed when COVID happens and their labor is needed. And then all of a sudden we, society, the rest, become more aware. And then within critical food studies, there are these ideas of gastro-nationalism, like certain foods have a national identity, or gastro-regionalism, but also gastro-racialization. There are ways that our ideas about food and the place that it comes from become racialized and can erase the important experiences and contributions and strengths that other people have contributed. And then part of what we're interested in doing, both through things like the film that the 4 directors, the young people created, and photography and other things, like how can our research be part of counteracting that invisibilization that identity might have. Like, you know, the project that you all are doing here that in many ways visibilizes rural Latinx families in Indiana who otherwise, within agriculture, who otherwise might not be thought of when we say Hoosier grown, you know, grown by Hoosiers for Hoosiers. So those are my thoughts about the topic today. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Dr. Holmes. Next up, we have Yumari Ruiz.
This is good. Okay, you are asking a lot. I'm holding a mic, I'm doing a button, I'm doing this, so this is a lot for me, people. And I'm also going to time myself so that I can make sure, because Lynn sent me an email saying, you only have that much time. Anyhow. So my name is Yuki Reese, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Public Health. And today, I really appreciate what Dr. Holmes has talked about. I appreciate the discussion about people involved in the supply chain and how being part of that system affects people. But I'm particularly interested in bringing your attention not only to the individuals that are in the supply chain that are working to deliver the food, plant the food, pick the food, but also their families. Because the factors that impact the lives of these workers also affects their families, it affects their communities, and it affects the greater society. So there's over 2 million agricultural workers in America, and largely the majority of Latino. And among them, there are approximately 36% that are undocumented. Now, for many reasons, and we're going to talk about a lot of those today, including these individuals' precarious legal status, they remain, as Dr. Holmes mentioned, a primarily invisible population. Even though, as pointed out, during COVID-19, they were termed an essential workforce. So I actually I've been thinking about COVID-19, and I want us to think about COVID-19 as well. I want you to think about and take yourself back to the beginning of COVID. Sorry, to the beginning, I told you, it's a lot. To the beginning of COVID. I want to see if you could take yourself to that place, and if you wouldn't mind, tapping into what you felt at that time. To the fear, to the concern, to the anxiety, to the uncertainty. If you wouldn't mind tapping in, ooh, I shouldn't tap into it, to your family, to your realization of how important they were, and just how much you really, really were worried about their safety. And with that in mind, I want you to think about that this is everyday life for many of the farm workers. Doing agricultural work requires great skills. It's relentless, it's exhausting, it can be extremely dangerous. Agricultural workers spend long hours harvesting crops in all types of weather. They risk injury and illness from heavy equipment or pesticide. And although farm workers provide an essential service, they often earn very low wages. They endure job-related hazards, substandard working and living conditions, including long hours, instability, and isolation. And farm workers face substantial health challenges and experience many challenges to accessing care. And for those that are undocumented, layer on top of all of that this persistent fear of being deported. But teens and children also work in the agricultural industry, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that agriculture for a long time has operated under looser child labor laws. So if we looked at the labor laws currently, 10 to 11-year-olds are able to work in non-hazardous farm workers, small farms that are not owned by their family. They work outside of their school hours, and they must have parental permission. But do note that this age group do not fall under the Fair Labor Standard Act of minimum wage. At 12 and 13 years, they are allowed to work in non-hazardous farm, work outside school hours with parental permission. If 14 and 15-year-olds, they are able to hold a non-hazardous farm work type of employment outside of school hours. And for those that are age 16 and 17, they can hold any farm work, whether it's hazardous or not, with unlimited work hours. And just so that you, in terms of reference, this is at least 2 years younger than in other industries. In terms of revisions to any of these laws, the only one, there was a revision to the US EPA's Workers' Protection Standard in 2015 that restricted anybody under the age of 18 from applying pesticides. So let's think a little bit about adolescence and why does our study focus on adolescence, or the work that I do and my colleagues do. So adolescence is this period of significant development. Youth during this time in their life experience a profound amount of change. But it's also during this time that physical, cognitive, social, and emotional capabilities are acquired that really underpin well-being throughout their entire life. Adolescent health is heavily shaped by their context. And while it's shaped by their individual and their personality, it's also shaped by the context in which these adolescents are embedded. Their family, their peers, their school, their neighborhood. If we were to think a little bit in terms of rural Latin, we would find that, especially in the Midwest, migration patterns have changed a great deal, and we're seeing that the population, the Latin population, is growing immensely in the Midwest. When we look at a subpopulation or a subgroup, rural Latin, Latinx, farm worker, agricultural, this is a specific subgroup that's critically understudied, but experiences very unique struggles and challenges. So for instance, while a rural Latin adolescent experiences stressors that are very common to most adolescents, academic stressors, peer-related stress, parent-child relationship conflict, it's also crucial to recognize that these are compounded by the stressors that they're experiencing, related to their race, place, social class, the intersection of all of the elements that Dr. Holmes has talked about. And that these stressors cut across all of these contexts. They experience acculturative stress. They experience family conflict and change, marginalization, discrimination, economic strain, and exposure to violence and victimization. Yet, despite the critical role that farm workers play in the U.S. agriculture, which is a billion-dollar business, research with Latin youth from families, agricultural and farm worker families, remains limited, particularly research that examines both sides of the human coin, our risks as well as our protective factors. In 2016, we attempted a pilot study to begin to populate that huge gap in the research literature. We conducted a study with 80 Latino migrant farm worker children ages 6 to 18, and we partnered with the Migrant Education Program, which provides educational services to youth across Indiana. For this particular study, we only worked with one portion or one region of Indiana that they work with. The findings for this preliminary study came from interviews as well as surveys that were collected during the summertime. And what we found when we looked at risk factors is that we found high levels of depression and anxiety. Also, youth expressed being exposed to economic stress, discrimination, and loneliness. Youth also reported early substance use, especially among the older children. They reported struggling academically. They reported feeling and experiencing unfair treatment by peers and teachers, mental health problems, and difficulty with school materials. And many were already pre-hypertensive or at risk for it. But likewise, we found protective factors. The relationship between school attachment, or how connected a youth felt with their school, whether it's their teacher, really did influence academic mastery and executive functioning, as well as resilience. Youth talked about their coping strategies, their optimism, perseverance. They talked about how their family encouraged them and communicated with them about how to stay healthy and their well-being. And they also talked about how they really relied on their parents for emotional support, in particular their mothers. This study led to the development of the study that we're currently doing, the Purdue Prentice Project. The Purdue Prentice Project is co-led by my colleague, Dr. Zoe Taylor, who's in the Department of Human Development and Family Sciences. This picture shows our leadership, which I know a few of them are here now. I'm going to point her out. Dr. Carizales, Olivia Reyes, and Jennifer Escobedo are here today. And in addition to this team, we have a nice group of fierce undergraduates, as well as some colleagues, some students from the Colombian-Purdue partnership that we have. So what's the purpose of this study? Oh, sorry. The purpose of this study, it's a longitudinal study that really is following Latinx youth ages 10 to 15 from rural agricultural and farm worker families across adolescence. And we want to follow them across this critical developmental stage and examine the effects of chronic stressors on their mental and physical health and identify factors that contribute to resilience that also protects youth from poor outcomes. This study is guided by an integrated framework that brings together bioecological framework as well as resilience. And really what it argues is that, again, youth are impacted by all of the contexts that they are embedded within, their peer relationships, families, school, and neighborhood, but it isn't deficit. It is not a deficit model focusing solely on the risk, but also looking at what are the strengths and assets within this population. This was a project funded by the National Institute of Minority Health. It's a mixed method study from youth and primary caregivers. It includes survey data, biometrics, NIH toolbox, and interviews, and participants are recruited through community resources. Some preliminary findings that we have to date include findings that both support what we found in our pilot study, but also that build on this particular study. At the individual level, what we found in terms of risk factors is that youth experience mental health distress, and that COVID-19 stressors predicted poor mental health, and it detrimentally impacted well-being, particularly optimism, connectedness, and happiness. We also found that harsh mother-child relationships directly and positively related to youth's aggressive behaviors. Moreover, anxiety was found to mediate this association between mother-child relationships and youth aggressive behaviors. And at the school and neighborhood level, we found that youth perceived or reported perceiving discrimination from authority figures, and that perceived discrimination negatively associated with school self-efficacy. In terms of protective factors, at the family level, we continue to see the importance of this strong connection between family support and decreased mental health symptoms. Youth reported being supported by their peers and families when feeling these feelings of oppression, or depression, and anxiety. At the school level, really having a supportive learning school can help youth feel connected to school. And then across multiple levels, we found that connectedness or feeling a sense of belonging, whether it is a sense of belonging to their own ethnic identity at the individual level, their family, or even their neighborhood, was found to positively influence youth health perceptions. So there are some limitations to these studies, the sample size. This particular data was cross-sectional youth data. So the next steps will be to expand the sample size, include multiple reporter data, and longitudinal. And so this is my final stuff. There are some recommendations. We need to continue to research and to examine the challenges as well as the strengths of this unique population of children. But this is community-based research, and this takes time and it takes trust within the community, which I very much appreciated reading your book and talking about the importance of trust. It requires a need for a pipeline to move this field forward, a need to include researchers that can carry out this research in health disparities and among vulnerable populations, but also a pipeline for community health workers. So indigenous leaders within the community that already have that trust, that have the knowledge, how do we bring them in? And by increasing them as community health workers, create an economic workforce as well within that community. We need to develop programming that goes beyond the focus of the individual and then examine these policies that are creating the systematic disparity in labor laws, migration laws, like how do we legalize this undocumented workforce, and laws that expand health access to quality, to care, but not just any care, quality care. And so with that, just some quick acknowledgements. My work, all our work, is impossible without our kids, without our families, without our partnerships, without my fabulous team, and without funding. So just wanted to acknowledge those. Thank you.
Dr. Swanson?
Of all the things. Sure, that sounds good. In the spirit of sort of doing things that we're not used to doing in the panel, today I'm not directly presenting research. I feel like I'm sort of talking about the things I observed at home in the rural Midwest while trying to understand other things in the world and seeing changes and thinking about ways that I guess some of the questions of sustainability, of food systems, of labor sort of intersect with, if we think about visibility and invisibility, perhaps an all too visible population. And so I'm going to talk about myself more than I ever do, which is sort of weird. And the other thing that I'm doing, which I don't usually do, is I'm not using slides. Usually geographers like to sort of distract everyone with maps and pictures and things. Instead, I'm going to let this logo sear into your brains up in the corner there. So I grew up on a farm in northwestern Illinois, one of those oft-mythologized family farms in the Midwest, passed down over several generations. When we moved onto this farm when I was a kid, we became the 5th generation of my Swedish-American family to live there. And just last year, we received a centennial farm plaque from the state of Illinois, recognizing the century since it was purchased by my great-great-grandparents. Adjoining the farm where I was raised were those of my uncles and my grandparents, all more or less farmed as one operation. And about 10 minutes to the south was my other grandparents' farm, where my dad often helped on top of other jobs he held in ag industries. Work on these farms was and is still today done by members of the family with the occasional hired hand, usually family friends, often those who are themselves one generation removed from the farm. I helped from time to time on both my mother and father's family farms. Indeed, still help when I'm asked, but most of my other interests usually kept me away from farm work. So while I enjoyed things like driving the truck, way before you were 16, running fence and building hog houses, my general dislike of getting dirty more often kept me inside, doing the books with my grandfather. When I left home to attend college in Iowa, I must confess that the very last thing I was interested in studying was anything related to the farm. The first time I had a choice in what to put on my walls as a child, I put up maps, and that's exactly what I wanted to go and study: global issues, geopolitics, international relations, faraway places, and unfamiliar cultures. Then, once I learned that even farm kids could study abroad, it was basically over. A summer study abroad program in Kenya led to a summer studying in Europe, which led to a winter break in Antarctica. After college, I went to law school to study international law, and by this time had mastered the art of finding ways to travel whenever possible, always on a shoestring. Subsequently, during graduate school, I spent a significant amount of time in the Middle East for language acquisition and dissertation fieldwork. It was through all this travel and time abroad, through experiencing a globalized world and learning about the ways that places were uniquely shaped, both by global and local forces, that I began to really want to better understand the Midwest and its global contexts. This was especially so as I began to grasp the changes taking place on the ground when I visited home, changes largely driven by the globalization of agricultural industries and the expansion and consolidation of of big ag and multinational ag corporations into every area of agriculture. When I first went off to college, I thought of the farm as a site largely disconnected from major global processes like globalization. When I would try to bring home discussions from school on topics like sustainability, things that seemed globally relevant, I was usually not much of an audience for that. I eventually understood this was the case because many of these discourses were not developed with farmers and instead were delivered by people as they looked down at farmers. So while some of this perceived isolation was certainly my own naivete, it's also true that significant changes have taken place over the past couple of decades particularly following NAFTA and other regional and global trade agreements. So while it may be tempting to see multi-generational farms as sites of stability, the reality is that the entanglements with globalized big ag required of virtually all farmers today to maintain lands and livelihoods has instead often made family farm sites of precarity. For many people in the rural Midwest, this has followed the deindustrialization of nearby cities, large and small, and the precarious economies that have characterized those places since the 1990s or earlier. I bring in all of this biography to emphasize the partiality and not universality of my experience of rural America, and the Midwest in particular, because indeed there are many other experiences of labor, of land, of migration, of globalization, and so on. Nonetheless, because the Midwestern family farm is so often mythologized as a rural ideal in the United States, and because it also seems integral to campaigns like Indiana Grown, it felt like a context worth describing. It's also within this context, through these experiences and observations, that I started to accumulate magnets, tote bags, pens, coasters, and other swag from farmers markets and small town shops with messages like Indiana Grown in virtually every state I have lived. Somewhere I have items printed with the Iowa equivalent, the Illinois equivalent, and I think even the North Carolina equivalent. Further, when I've asked students in Intro to Human Geography courses to map the origin of produce available in local supermarkets, they come back reporting that they've observed these logos on tags, on signage all over produce departments, marketing products grown in that state. I see these sorts of campaigns as responses to some of the changes that globalization of ag and food production have brought. These include the perception that commodities that can be or were once grown or manufactured nearby should be again. That in a globalized world, things made in the US or Indiana are inherently better than those made elsewhere. Even that anything local is under threat by anything global. Given my relationship with agriculture, specifically with farmers, I've often been inclined to pick up the magnets, the tote bags, the bumper stickers as a sign of support for family, friends, and neighbors. Nonetheless, I'm not convinced that a campaign like Indiana Grown can really do much to address these concerns, and would further argue that such attempts to make products grown in Indiana or elsewhere more visible, of course, conceal or distract us from important questions around sustainability, food justice, and globalization. So indeed, my immediate reaction to the Indiana Grown, I was not lucky enough to see it in a trash pile at an airport, but it was that it looked to me like a corporate logo that any multinational ag company might adopt. A seed company or a chemical company, something that came at the corner of a post that arrived in the mail at the farm. In this way, such a branding campaign does not depart from, but rather follows the logics of the multinational ag corporations that have shaped rural Indiana's experiences of globalization. It's symbolic of something, but not the thing itself. The text Indiana Grown, while highlighting the state of Indiana as the source of products, should also remind us of its namesake. Prior to the dispossession and colonization of their lands, the Shawnee, Miami, Bayah, Potawatomi, Delaware, Wyandotte, Kickapoo, Piankashaw, Chickasaw, and other indigenous nations called the state of Indiana home. These nations, of course, had their own relationships with these lands and their own agricultural practices and traditions. So certainly questions of food justice and even sustainability require engagement with and not a forgetting of that history. Second, as a geographer reading the word grown, I think of the earth itself, the land, the soil, the very dirt in which something grows, as well as the water that flows through it. Using the passive form of the word, that is, something is grown in Indiana, further suggests an emphasis on land, on territory, but not on labor, for that would require a different tense or a different verb altogether. As such, Indiana Grown signals to me much more about place than anything else, and agricultural labor is erased entirely. This emphasis on place is not an uncommon response to globalization. Indeed, publics around the world have often lamented the loss of local senses of place, of local traditions, of local customs, or to the uniqueness of local places in a globalized world. But what is this place that the Indiana Grown campaign is selling? Fortunately for this geographer, a map is included in the logo. But it's not just any map. Rather, it is, as the late great historian of nationalism Benedict Anderson would describe it, a map as logo. In Imagine Communities, Anderson traces the origins of the practice of coloring different political units, like states, on maps, different colors, tracing this back to European practices of distinguishing colonial holdings from one another. Through this practice, Anderson writes, quote, "Each colony appeared like a detachable piece of a jigsaw puzzle. As this jigsaw effect became normal, each piece could be wholly detached from its geographic context. In its final form, all explanatory glosses could be summarily removed. Lines of latitude and longitude, place names, signs for rivers, seas, and mountains, neighborhoods, pure sign, no longer compass to the world. In this shape, the map entered an infinitely reproducible series, available for transfer to posters, official seals, letterheads, magazine and textbook covers, tablecloths, and hotel walls. Instantly recognizable, everywhere visible, the logo map penetrated deep into the popular imagination. Anderson is writing here about post-colonial imaginations of the nation in Southeast Asia. Yet the power of the map as logo transcends this place and time, and is indeed the form that the map takes in the Indiana grown graphic. It is an Indiana literally disconnected from the world, recaptured from the forces of globalization perhaps, yet also disconnected from its neighboring states, Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois. Of course, the two sides of a state border are anything but disconnected. Such disconnection wholly contradicts how social networks, food systems, watersheds, regional economies, and many other things actually function in the world. The map as logo is a piece lifted from a broader puzzle, also emphasizes borders and bounding, clearly delineating us here and them there. But who is the us? Hoosiers, I believe the campaign indicates. However, the popular imaginations of rural America on which campaigns like this rely continue to center the family farm, often coded as white, and idealized as patriarchal in the sense they're passed down from father to son over the course of generations. For those drawn to such imaginations, they may perceive continuity and stability, contrasting the perceived uncertainties of globalization and a, quote, changing country, again racially coded. However, questions of food justice and of environmental and economic sustainability in a globalized world cannot be addressed through disconnection or isolation. Instead, they require thinking about new alternative forms of connectedness and interdependence. There are movements, projects, and initiatives all over the world that I find compelling. Some local food movements, slow food movements, for example, that provide models for doing so. Such initiatives center economic, racial, and economic justice, as well as environmental and economic sustainability, while directly challenging the organization of rural economies that Big Ag has forged through globalization. Such initiatives, however, require the hard work of organizing, relationship building, network forming, fundraising, public education, and so on. Much more work than logos alone are prepared to do. Thank you.
And Dr. Torres.
It's going to be hard to top that up. So I have a request. As I put my presentation, can everybody stand up and stretch or do something? I believe that we shouldn't be seated for more than half an hour. Okay, do some stretching, turn around, look at your neighbor, say hi, whatever you need. Okay, here we go. Okay, you can sit now. I don't know where it is. So, oh, right here. Right here. This works? That's it? This works? Yeah? Yeah, okay. Oh, okay, yeah, I speak actually very loud, so I'm probably not gonna need it. My name is Ariana Torres. I'm an associate professor. And there are two words, horticulture and economics. I do horticulture economics, so 2 departments, 2 bosses. Great. One of them is here. So I gotta look what I say. But yeah, I'm actually a research extension and teaching professor, so I have the 3-way kind of appointment. A lot of what I do is extension, and it's very interesting. I was wondering, why would you invite an applied economist to speak? Because you want to hear about numbers? Well, good for you, because I don't have any numbers. So I'm going to talk about things that I'm interested. I actually, a disclaimer, I do train farmers to use logos. Because I do marketing training. So I'm a marketing specialist. And I believe there's value in conveying information and stories. They don't have to be through logos, can be claims, can be labels, can be stories, can be photos. But we have to start somewhere. And I think there is that need to convey and make agriculture closer to the consumers, to educate consumers how things are produced. But today we're not going to talk about that, neither my research. We're going to talk about things that I find interesting and I actually find, like Seth was saying, actually kind of appalling, if you may. So that's Indiana grown. That's a map that Nathan was talking about. But there's so many labels. And Nathan was talking about the other states. So we have Illinois, Kentucky, Midwest grown. I actually work with controlled environment agriculture growers, and they're thinking, well, even from Indiana grown farmers, they're like, well, Indiana grown doesn't do much to me. I need to go Midwest grown. And I'm like, well, let me think about that. So they're trying to do their own experiments because there's so much money in CEA, in controlled environment agriculture, that they want to understand what works. And apparently, not much. So we call it state-branded foods. So foods are branded by a state. And they started about 40 years ago. So basically, there was a bunch of people in Washington saying, well, we need to support rural production and rural farming, and the word local came around very often. And they have financially, philosophical motives. Right now, in a given state, up to 2,000, I promise, this is the only number I'm going to show. Up to 2,000 products can be marketed as a state-branded food. So it's a lot. It's not minimal. I actually don't do research on Indiana grown, but I do research on labels. And there's a lot of research. Camila, one of my graduate students here, is actually doing a lot of that. But what is the goal? What was the purpose of that? And on the next slide, I'm gonna argue about that. The goal was to increase social welfare. And social welfare is basically making everybody in a community or a society better. Not only the farmers, not only the consumers, not only everyone. So how do we increase that social welfare? Through a logo, or creation of state-branded foods. Producer marketing efforts, consumer awareness, consumer demand, so try to increase that consumer demand for a specific type of food. And then increase preferences, so kind of like this sense of pride or proud in a given state. And a lot of it came around with this geopolitical boundary that a state, local is anything within 400 miles. Well, that can be true, but that's most likely not true. So these boundaries actually food can be closer than 400 miles and not be local, cannot be from the same state. So there's a lot of dichotomies right there. So there's always a but. Even though that was great 40, 30 years ago, I think there's a lot of things that we need to remain to answer. And I think as we have a very young crowd that I recognize, I think it is important to think, what is our place as we move forward in our careers? Even for us that we're older, what is our place to keep doing research, and how do we educate students that are at Purdue? So I'm gonna show you a few buts. Most of the studies, I went through a whole literature review, and most of the studies I found very small increases in social welfare. So are states better off after a logo? And most people say no, because there's so many logos, there's so many labels. So one of the things is, can we look into the aggregated demand? Because here's the other thing. Consumers, when they buy something, you're going to buy popcorn from Indiana-grown popcorn. But then when you're going to go to a grocery store, you're going to buy not only popcorn, you're going to buy a bunch of products. That aggregated purchase, is that going to impact, or is going to be impacted by Indiana grown, or is going to be dissipated as you choose multiple products? So next time that you go to a grocery store, think about why are you purchasing or picking that tomato or picking that box of cereal. And then you're going to see the whole array of logos and labels that you're going to find. Or the other thing that is happening, why there hasn't been any impact, because actually, kind of like what Nathan was talking about, we're shifting. So we're trying to buy something from Indiana, pretending that something from the neighboring state is not good. So we're trying to, within that, incentivizing that pride within the state, we're trying to keep things and shifting demand towards our products, but there is an implicit message that things from the other states are not as good. And the other thing is that size actually matters. States are bigger, and you have a logo that it's a state brand. When you have a big state, you have a consumer demand is going to support it. But states like Indiana, that's where a lot of the impact hasn't included. That's the first one. There are a lot of spillover effects, and that's just an economic term to tell you that we have people living within the borders, between Indiana and Ohio that are not going to choose, even though they live in Indiana, they're not going to choose products from Indiana because they're closer to Ohio and they're better quality or whatever. All the states are doing the same. So there's a lot of competition. Which one is better, Michigan apples or Indiana apples? And what do we pick is going to, again, depend on your budget, how much you're going to spend. And right now, we know that inflation is really, really hurting us. But also, what is in the marketplace? What are we going to choose? So there is a lot of, and one of the things that it goes related to what the other speakers were talking about is these policies that are actually trying to increase demand or increase sales of a within state product. It actually can have a social welfare that is negative because we have a lot of people living in the borders, but we also have a lot of competition from other states. And then preferences are heterogeneous, another very famous economics phrase. But there are a lot of complements and substitutes. And then when you choose, it's not a very simple. So that's why a lot of these campaigns or public funds are actually not having any impact. Again, size of the market. There are other unintended policy consequences that may vary by state, region, and by products. So we talked a little bit about ethnocentrism, thinking that because I am from Indiana, Indiana products are going to be better. For states like Indiana, it actually tends to be low when you're looking into food products at grocery stores. So if you get that ethnocentrism, or rather that pride, and make Hoosiers feel very proud about everything that Hoosiers produce, that ethnocentrism may actually impact Indiana grown. But there is that competition from other states. Actually, that Midwest grown is one of those regional labels and collective advertising. So that's one of the things that I actually think may be better, but again, we're creating borders. We're creating division. Back to your point. There are things that are cooperative-like, and I know cooperative is not a good word for a lot of in the capitalist world, but there is this idea that if we have different states that have similar environmental and agronomic conditions and have products that are quite similar, having a Midwest grown label may actually be more appealing. Because for someone in Chicago, buying something from Indiana may have any relevance, but buying something from the Midwest may be more important. And then again, tapping into that consumer loyalty, do we feel obligated because we're buying things from Indiana, or do we feel averse because I don't want to buy anything from Indiana? So a lot of these things are actually playing a role, and one of the things that I want to bring attention is there's a lot of labels. I mean, just go anywhere and it's overwhelming. And actually, the next farm bill is they're thinking about reducing the number of labels and actually looking through what labels should be included in food. Because there's a lot of labels. There's a lot of people who buy things with a label that it's very expensive. Just because it's expensive, they think it's going to do better. And that's not necessarily true. And the last point I have, that to me it's very important. These campaigns, these state-branded foods are public funds to support individual private goods. How do we handle that? How do we handle that all the money that are going from our taxes or other incentives are going to support specific products? So are we thinking about where are those products coming from within a border, where the markets are selling to? The products that are the most or least recognized, I don't think it should be. I think those are things that as these policies are more developed, and I know there's been a lot of push for Indiana grown lately, especially lately, how is those dollars going to impact our state? And then consumers differ. So with that, I wanted to thank you, and that's my economics point of view.
We have a reception outside that started just a couple minutes ago. So those of you who've already left have gotten first dibs on that food. But please join me in thanking everybody here, and we'll talk more outside.